It is Monday, June 8th, 2026, and the clearest theme in today's news is stress on systems. Not one system, many of them. Transit security in New York, disaster preparedness in the Philippines, immigration law in federal court, the cattle supply chain in the American Southwest, and the enormous physical build-out behind artificial intelligence. The through line is simple. Risk is no longer abstract. It is showing up in train stations, courtrooms, data centers, farms, markets, and city plans. And for investors, policy watchers, and anyone trying to understand where the next pressure point may appear, today's headlines are less a list of isolated events than a map of weak spots. Let's start in New York. 6 people were injured Sunday evening in a stabbing inside Penn Station, one of the busiest transportation hubs in the United States, sitting directly beneath Madison Square Garden. Authorities said a suspect was taken into custody after the attack, which happened around 7 p.m., less than a day before thousands of fans were expected at the Garden for Game 3 of the NBA Finals. The facts here are still developing. The interpretation is already clear. In a dense city, public safety is inseparable from event logistics, transit operations, and crowd confidence. For New York, this is not just a policing story. Penn Station is a choke point. It links Amtrak, the Long Island Railroad, NJ Transit, and New York City subway lines. When violence hits a place like that, the ripple effect is bigger than the immediate crime scene. Commuters change plans. Event security tightens. City officials face pressure to show visible control, especially when a major sports event is happening upstairs. And this summer, New York is already preparing for a far bigger crowd management test, the 2026 FIFA World Cup Final. State and city officials announced a free ticketed watch party for up to 50,000 people on Central Park's Great Lawn on July 19th, with a lottery opening June 11th. That event is meant to be a civic celebration. But after the Penn Station attack, the operational question becomes sharper. How do you create open, joyful public space while maintaining enough security to keep people confident? Governor.ny.gov. Now to the Philippines, where the stakes are life and death on a much larger scale. A magnitude 7.8 offshore earthquake struck the southern Philippines on Monday, killing at least 35 people and injuring more than 200. The quake sent a roughly 1 meter or 3-foot tsunami into nearby coasts. In General Santos, several mostly low-rise buildings collapsed or sustained heavy damage, and tsunami damage was reported in at least one coastal village. Smaller waves were measured in Indonesia and Palau, and as far away as southern Japan. The fact is the earthquake. The lesson is infrastructure. The Philippines sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, so seismic risk is part of the geography. But geography does not determine the death toll by itself. Building standards, enforcement, coastal warning systems, evacuation routes, and emergency response capacity all help decide whether a natural hazard becomes a mass casualty disaster. That is an important distinction. Earthquakes cannot be prevented. Collapses can sometimes be reduced. Tsunami warnings cannot stop waves, but they can by minutes. And in disasters, minutes can be the difference between survival and catastrophe. The same theme, fragile systems under stress, is playing out in the U.S. food supply. The New World screwworm, a flesh-eating parasite that had been absent from Texas for decades, has reappeared in the United States. The U.S. Department of Agriculture confirmed a case in a calf in Zavala County, Texas, last week, and additional cases have since intensified concern. The parasite's larvae infest wounds in warm-blooded animals, including livestock, pets, wildlife, and in rare cases, humans. Federal and state officials are now racing to contain it through surveillance, animal movement controls, treatments, and the possible use of sterile insect releases. For consumers, this may sound remote. For the cattle industry, it is not. Screwworm can force quarantines, veterinary treatment, lost animals, disrupted transport, and trade restrictions. The investor angle is also real. If an outbreak spreads, it could affect cattle supplies, feeder prices, slaughter schedules, and processors exposed to livestock availability. The forward-looking question is not whether this is a problem. It is whether officials can contain it before it becomes a supply chain problem. Now, let's move from livestock to the other major infrastructure race of the day, artificial intelligence. Apple used its developers conference to preview a revamped Siri and new AI features, part of a broader effort to turn artificial intelligence into something that feels less like a separate app and more like an operating system layer. The company's pitch continues to lean heavily on privacy and device integration, but the rollout is uneven. Reports say the new Siri AI features will not be available in the European Union at launch, reflecting Apple's continuing friction with Europe's Digital Markets Act. The fact is, Apple is trying to catch up in consumer AI. The interpretation is that Apple's advantage is not necessarily being first, it is distribution. If Siri becomes genuinely useful across iPhones, iPads, and Macs, Apple does not need to win the chatbot wars in the abstract. It needs to make AI feel native to the devices people already use. But the bigger AI story today may not be Apple's software. It may be the plumbing. Amazon announced a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar agreement with Corning to supply optical fiber, cable, and connectivity products for Amazon's expanding U.S. data center infrastructure. The deal is expected to create about 1,000 jobs at Corning facilities in North Carolina and support additional construction jobs. That matters because AI systems need more than chips. They need data centers, power, fiber, cooling, land permitting, and a resilient domestic supply chain. NVIDIA is pushing the same point from another direction. NVIDIA and SK Hynix announced a multi-year technology partnership focused on next-generation memory, aligned with NVIDIA's AI infrastructure roadmap. In plain English, the AI race is not just about who has the smartest model. It is about who can secure the memory, chips, and manufacturing partnerships needed to run those models at scale. This is where investors should slow down. The public face of AI is software. The constraint is physical capacity. Fiber, high bandwidth memory, GPUs, power grids, substations, cooling systems, data center geography. If AI demand continues to grow, the beneficiaries may not only be the platform companies. They may also include the industrial suppliers that make the AI build-out possible. In Washington, the big legal story is immigration and the limits of executive power. A federal judge in Boston struck down the Trump administration's $100,000 fee on new H-1B visa petitions, ruling that the executive branch exceeded its authority and violated the Administrative Procedure Act. The H-1B program is used by companies to hire highly skilled foreign workers, especially in technology, healthcare, engineering, and research. For now, the ruling preserves the existing fee structure, although appeals are possible. The legal significance goes beyond one fee. Courts are again being asked to decide where presidential discretion ends and congressional authority begins. Immigration law gives the executive branch meaningful power, but fees that look like taxes or policies that remake a statutory program tend to raise separation of powers questions. Separately, the Justice Department announced denaturalization actions against 17 naturalized citizens accused of serious offenses or fraud in the citizenship process. The government says the cases involve allegations including sexual abuse of a minor, financial fraud, and drug-related offenses. The key legal point, revoking citizenship is one of the most severe civil actions the government can pursue, so these cases will likely face careful scrutiny. The political backdrop remains volatile. President Trump abruptly ended a Meet the Press interview after being pressed on unsupported claims that elections were rigged, including claims about California's vote counting process. For news organizations, the episode raises a recurring dilemma. How aggressively do you fact-check a powerful guest in real time, especially if doing so risks losing access? Markets, meanwhile, are trying to process all of this without losing the thread. U.S. stocks rebounded Monday after Friday's sell-off. The S&P 500 rose about 0.3%, the Nasdaq climbed about 0.9%, and the Dow slipped about 0.2%. That tells us investors are still willing to buy dips, especially in technology and chip-linked names. But the rebound does not erase the tension between resilient asset prices and more cautious households. The New York Fed's May survey showed that roughly 48% of Americans said they were financially worse off than a year earlier, the highest share since January 2023. The share expecting their finances to improve over the next year, relative to those expecting things to worsen, fell to the lowest level since October 2022. That is the household version of today's broader theme. Systems may still be functioning, but confidence is fragile. There were also important signals from healthcare and biotech. Boehringer Ingelheim reported Phase 3 data for survodutide, an investigational obesity and liver disease drug, showing large reductions in liver fat and visceral fat in people with obesity and at-risk MASLD. The company said the study met its main endpoints, with liver fat normalization reached by about 6 in 10 treated participants after 48 weeks. This is promising, but it is not the same as proof of long-term outcomes. Safety, durability, and clinical endpoints will matter before investors or patients can draw broader conclusions. Johnson & Johnson also moved deeper into oncology, agreeing to acquire Firefly Bio for $1 billion in cash. The deal gives J&J access to a degrader antibody conjugate platform, focused in part on KRAS-driven tumors, an area of cancer biology that has long been difficult to drug and is now drawing intense industry interest. This is a strategic pipeline bet, not an immediate earnings story. J&J.com. In sports and culture, Broadway crowned Schmigadoon Best Musical at the 2026 Tony Awards, held Sunday at Radio City Music Hall, and hosted by Pink. In Chicago, Stacey King, the three-time Bulls champion who became a beloved broadcaster, died at 59. And in Paris, Alexander Zverev defeated Flavio Cobolli in 5 sets to win his first Grand Slam title at the French Open. There was also a notable sports law ruling. A Texas judge cleared Texas Tech quarterback Brendan Sorsby to play this season, despite NCAA gambling violation allegations involving wagers on college sports, including bets on his own team while he was at Indiana. That ruling lands at a sensitive moment. Legalized sports betting has expanded quickly, but the integrity rules for athletes remain central to public trust. If courts increasingly second-guess NCAA eligibility decisions, college sports may face a more complicated enforcement landscape. APnews.com. So what comes next? Scenario 1, response systems hold. New York tightens security around Madison Square Garden without major disruption. Philippine rescue teams complete damage assessments and the casualty count stabilizes. USDA and state officials contain screwworm before it becomes a national livestock shock. Markets absorb AI infrastructure spending as a long-term growth investment, not just a margin risk. Scenario 2, pressure spreads. A high-profile security incident changes crowd behavior in New York. Earthquake damage in the Philippines proves more extensive than early reports suggest. Screwworm cases expand beyond the initial clusters. Investors begin asking whether the AI capital expenditure cycle is becoming too expensive, too concentrated, or too dependent on constrained suppliers. Scenario 3. The courts become the main arena. Immigration fees, citizenship revocation, election claims, NCAA gambling enforcement, and regulatory battles over AI all move through judges rather than legislatures. That does not mean courts are controlling every policy outcome. It does mean institutions are increasingly being asked to define the boundaries after political actors push them. The takeaway is this: today's headlines are not random noise. They are stress tests. A transit hub tests urban security. An earthquake tests building standards. A parasite tests agricultural defenses. AI tests industrial capacity. Immigration cases test executive authority. Consumer surveys test the optimism behind market gains. The facts will keep changing, especially in the disaster and public safety stories. But the larger message is already visible. The next phase of risk is operational. It is about whether institutions can execute under pressure, communicate clearly, and invest before weak points become breaking points. That is the briefing for Monday, June 8, 2026. This is for informational purposes only, and is not investment, legal, medical, safety, or financial advice.